The year was 1942, and America was fighting a war against Japan. The American military was using coded messages to give battle information to their men. There was one problem, though. Every code the Americans made was being cracked wide open by the Japanese, giving them an edge in battle. America needed to make an unbreakable code quick to win the war and save as many lives as possible, but the only problem was finding the code. Philip Johnston, a former World War I veteran, was the first to suggest that the Marines use Navajos as signalmen, also called radiomen, in 1942 when he read a newspaper article about how the Army used Native Americans as signalmen to send messages about shortages of supplies in World War I. Growing up on a Navajo reservation, Johnston knew how unknown the language was to the world. He then presented his idea to military officials who thought it to be a possible success. Military officials soon set up a test run to see if the language would work. 2 weeks later, Johnston returned with 4 Navajos to do the demonstration. The 4 Navajos were given 6 messages to translate from English into Navajo that would be commonly used in battle. The 4 Navajos managed to translate the messages almost perfectly. A week later, a message was sent to the Marine Corps that strongly recommended the recruitment of 200 Navajos for the Amphibious Corps Pacific Fleet. On May 5, 1942, the first 29 Navajos arrived at the recruitment depot in San Diego. Little did they know, they were about to bring a change to the war in the Pacific. There's a big question, though. Why did these men want to fight? Many young Navajo men added years to their age to meet the age requirement, and one even took a few years off his age. All America had ever done to them was kill their livestock and worse, force Navajo children to attend boarding school, to squeeze out their culture, and turn them into quote-unquote normal people. Chester Nez, one of the founding fathers of the Navajo Code, describes his childhood experience when caught speaking Navajo in his book, Code Talker, the first and only memoir by one of the original Navajo Code Talkers of World War II. Mr. Nez's co-author, Judith Avila, describes this and others' punishments for speaking their native language.
The boarding school's purpose was to kill the Indian, save the man. That was a quote from one of the founders. And what they did to the Indian children is they tried to take away all of their culture. And of course, part of that, a huge part of that, was language. So when the kids spoke Navajo, they were kicked or hit or had their teeth brushed with that brown lye soap. Phil's naphtha soap is what it's called. Chester said the thing he hated the most was the soap. He'd rather be kicked or hit. So they were very cruel at those boarding schools, and they were very determined to get rid of Navajo, and luckily they failed.
So why exactly did these Navajo men want to fight for a country that had done nothing but abuse them in the past?
One reason was that Native young men were raised as warriors, and so were the young women. And warriors protect the land they love and the people they love. So the Japanese attacked us when they bombed Pearl Harbor. So Chester felt like he had to fight. That's one reason. Now, the other reason was he knew Native American history. He knew that Europeans had come in and pushed the natives off their land and had broken every treaty with the natives. And he figured if we lost World War II, it would happen all over again with the Germans and the Japanese taking over. And he didn't want that to happen.
After the Marine basic training, the 29 Navajos went to the Marine Force Training Center at Camp Elliott. It was there the Navajo Code was made, changing the war in the Pacific. The 29 Navajos were put into a room where an officer, after locking the door, told them why the Marines needed the Navajo. He said that they needed the Navajo to devise a code using their native language to help win the war in the Pacific. The men started by making the American alphabet with Navajo letters. For example, A in Navajo Code was red ant, but said in Navajo, so it was pronounced Wolachi. The men tried to make the letters easy to remember so no mistakes would be made in battle. One mistake could cost thousands of lives. In 5 days, the Navajo men had successfully created the full alphabet in Navajo. The next step was for the alphabet to be memorized in the minds of these men. To save time, military terms were made into Navajo words. For example, the word for tank in Navajo became turtle, but said in Navajo. Apart from the alphabet, there were almost 220 military terms. Now that the code was complete, there was only one way to prove itself, and that way was battle. Guadalcanal was where the code was first used in battle. The once beautiful island was now a living hell from the continuous artillery bombardments in battle. 15 Navajos were sent to send messages in code. It was a test to see how well the code talkers could remember the code under heavy enemy fire. The code proved to be a success at Guadalcanal, so much so that the General of 1st Marine Division, Alexander Vandegrift, sent word back to the U.S. saying how great the code was. He said, "The enemy never understood it. We don't understand it either, but it works. Send us some more Navajos." At Guadalcanal, the code talkers proved that the code worked. Pretty soon, there were over 400 Navajos fighting in the Pacific. Here is an example of a messaging code that was sent during the Battle of Iwo Jima, said by Peter MacDonald, one of the last remaining code talkers.
What does that mean? This is what he said in Navajo. Sheep, eyes, nose, deer, destroyer, tea, mouse, turkey, onion, sick horse, 3, 6, 2, bear.
The Navajo Code continued to be a success in the Pacific. In the Battle of Iwo Jima, the 6 code talkers under 5th Marine Division sent more than 800 messages in the first 48 hours of battle without a single mistake. Major Howard Connor, the signalman officer of 5th Marine Division, said, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would have never taken Iwo Jima." The code talkers continued to participate in almost every major battle in the Pacific. The code began with nearly 220 original terms, but by the end of the war, the code had expanded to 411. Without the code, we might have never won the war in the Pacific. When the war ended, you probably expect these men to return home as heroes, but that was not the case. The American government kept the code classified, keeping its importance to the war hidden. This made finding jobs as civilians much more difficult for the code talkers.
When the young Navajo men, including Chester, came back and looked for a job, because many of them realized that going back to the reservation was not something that they could do and really have a future. When they were interviewed, they really couldn't tell the person interviewing them what a huge thing they'd already been a part of and already accomplished. So unfortunately, many of those young men never found a job. Many of them died within a few years of getting back from the war, despite their heroism.
It stayed like this for many years. It was not until 1968, when the Navajo Code became declassified, that the world knew how America won the war in the Pacific. The code talkers gained national recognition when President Ronald A. Reagan made August the 14th National Code Talker Day, giving tribute to the Navajo and other Native American groups, saying these men gave their special talents and their lives so others might live. Today, the remaining code talkers are honored for their services. Even though each year the number of code talkers falls, their legacy lives on. These men volunteered to fight, not because they had to, but because they loved America. The Navajo Code was the only code in World War II that was never broken. proving it to truly be the code of all codes.